Okay, so tonight we're going to look at different profiles for bowl gouges because one of the things you've probably noticed is that there are a lot of folks out there that are selling bowl gouges that put their names on them and tout that you can do absolutely everything with theirs because theirs is the best. And then you'll see a different person with a different profile and virtually the same story. So what's going on here? Now, I did anyone bring one of their bowl gouges for comparison? Wow. It's a good thing I came prepared. This is vastly more bowl gouges than any one person should own. However, this is for mostly for a demonstration. There are 3 that I use on a very regular basis. So in this package, we have, let's see, can we look from the top? We have the profile that's been made very famous by David Ellsworth, and 20 some years ago he showed me how to sharpen this one. It works really well. I've practiced it very well and I use it quite often. He showed a way early on in the 90s how to grind this freehand, and then later on he developed a little jig that would hold it and a little arm that would hold it in a V-arm, and then you could do it with a little bit more ease. A little while later, a new version of that jig came out, and lo and behold, the 2 of them are at slightly different angles. In fact, you get about 50 degrees out of one jig and 60 degrees out of the other jig. And he doesn't specify what size wheel to use, so if you change the wheel and you don't, in other words, he has, oh, thank you. He has this specific profile, and if you look on his published instructions for sharpening it, it doesn't specify the wheel size, and it doesn't absolutely specify the position for the pocket. In other words, there's a lot of slop in it, and it doesn't matter because 3 people may get 3 different gouges, follow the instructions reasonably well, they'll be similar, and they'll all work, and they all call it the Ellsworth profile. Stuart Batty has a profile that you make by not holding it with a jig, but setting it at a 45-degree angle to the nose, 45-degree angle on the side, and essentially a square in the corner. And he'll tell you that this is absolutely perfect for doing the whole bowl, and those differ quite a bit between 45 degrees and 60 degrees. We don't have our grinder out here, do we? Okay, there's a very grind jig that grips the tool rather like this, has an arm that sticks out, and that arm is articulatable. It can go into 7 different positions. Lo and behold, if you set up the grinder, set the grinder correctly, and then change the angle of the articulation, you can get a grind angle that goes from, I measured it, 35 degrees all the way up to 80 degrees. So do you think that all of those will be useful? Phil's given me a very big no. Well, at, so in general, I'm mostly referring people to between 40 and 60 to 65 degrees, and that those tools will do most everything that you need. But the steeper tools go around the corner, hit the bottom of a bowl, especially a small diameter one, much more nicely. And I'll show you when turning between centers how you can get the bottom of the outside of the bowl, and we'll see that coming up in a minute. The very steep angle tool is good for that. Now think also about what type of wood that we're cutting. So if think of a plank of wood, and the tree grows with fibers going from the base up to the top, and it brings water from the roots, and it makes sugar up in the top, and so water goes up and sugar comes down and it gets distributed through the tree. And if we slice those logs and then make some planks, the grain is running all along the length of the plank. Imagine this being a piece of lumber. The grain lines are running along this way, and we have what we call a face, and we have what we call an edge. Now this might be tangential, this might be circumferential. It doesn't really matter. We have two faces that are going in the direction of the grain, and one face that goes dead across it. And this is what we call cutting end grain. So now, if we want to make a bowl and we start with a log section, we have grain lines running across. This came out of the tree roughly like this. There was another half, there was more stuff around it, and I turned a rough circle here. We'll spin it on the lathe with the grain running across like this. And so as this piece of wood is spinning towards me, I'm going to be cutting face grain and end grain and face grain and end grain. And so we're going to have to set our tool in a position that's going to be capable of doing both of those. And soon you'll see that when we're cutting over here, it's going to be very different than when we come around the corner and we cut along the bottom of the bowl, where we're cutting mostly along face grain and almost no end grain. If you use a hand plane or a chisel or a carving tool where you are putting the force into the cutting, we want to set the tool to the angle that's going to give us the easiest cut. Now, a lot of the power, the lathe, comes from the motor, so we don't have to be quite so efficient and we can still get the job done. But if we set it up to be more efficient, it's going to cut easier, it's going to dull the tool slower, and it's going to leave a better surface finish. So when we cut end grain with a chisel or a hand plane, what's the angle of that chisel or hand plane? It's on the low side of the useful range. And when we're cutting along the surface, cutting in the direction of the grain, we want to avoid a very low angle because that knife edge could go in between the fibers and split it like firewood. So it's a detriment to have a small angle when you're cutting along the grain. It's good to have the small angle when you're cutting the end grain. We'll bring the angle way up to about 55 degrees in a hand plane to cut along the fibers, and especially when you have curly fibers where the grain is actually undulating like this. You can even go up to a higher angle. So now you can see where the 40 to 65 degree angle range of the tool really comes in. So could we just have a couple people comment and say, what is the, do you even know the angle of your bowl gouge, or what profile you're using? And does anyone here use more than one bowl gouge, specifically because the two tools behave differently? A few hands. That's good. When we're using any of these bowl gouges in the classical bevel-guided cut, we will be anchoring the tool to the wood, bringing the handle up until it begins to cut, cutting a chip right on the very center. The bevel slides along the surface created by the previous rotation, then guides the tool into a nice smooth surface because it's always rubbing on the previous rotation, probably previous 100 or so rotations. And that is where the tip of the tool is cutting. If we cut more aggressively, we start to use some of the side of the tool. So in fact, we have two different parts of the tool that we need to control, and there are lots of nuances here, and I'll show you all of these tools cutting on the outside of this piece of wood, and we'll see how similar they are, and then we'll look at some of the nuances of how we can get slightly better surfaces and where to use the tool that gives us the best surface, and especially when you have punky wood, figured wood, really hard wood. The extremes of the woods often require, or you'll have an advantage by using one of the specialty tools when you're at an extreme. And cherry and a lot of the woods in the middle hardness, butternut, walnut, all of those cut very easily with just about any of the tools. So here we have cherry, one of the most forgiving woods and a very beautiful one. So tonight I am going to use a chuck with some relatively big jaws because it's the one that was free and had 1¼ threads on it. And I'm using a very secure and sure center or drive center for this. It has a center point and it has two wings that bite into the wood very nicely. It's good for really rugged pieces of wood. Now, I like to use this one in these big jaws because the bulk of this sort of dangerous looking tool is now quite well hidden in these jaws. If you put it in the tiny jaws, you've got these big flat pieces of metal flying about. And I don't like using it in any other chuck or any other set of jaws than this one. I like to use a drive center that fits into the jaws of the chuck so that I can leave the chuck on the lathe. I can mount a piece between centers, turn the outside, put a spigot on it, grab it, take this drive piece out, flip the piece of wood around, do the inside. The chuck can stay on the lathe for the entire day of bowl turning. So now I'll mark the center of the bowl, and I can make a pretty good estimate of where the center is when I'm looking down on something that's approximately a circle. When I tilt it off to the side and I look from the side, I don't estimate anywhere near as well. So I usually make the mark, touch it to the very center point, and push just hard enough so that I no longer have to hold it on the left-hand side. There's enough of a dent in the wood. I'll bring the tool rest up towards the wood, and notice that I removed bark in the area. I just used a chisel. There are all sorts of ways of doing it. They're all perfectly adequate. And I can bring the tailstock up against the piece of wood, and this tailstock has a center cup with no center point. And so I mounted it, and it's a little bit off. It's certainly not well balanced. So I can loosen the tail center, come back over here, take a look, make this approximately perpendicular to the axis, move the piece back in. I can rotate it halfway around. I can do the same thing again, so I can do it in the x-axis and the y-axis. I can make little adjustments, and after I remove the bulk of the wood and have something that's round, I can adjust it again should I want to. So I'll lock the tailstock, drive the ram in, squeeze the piece of wood, generally finding a place where I can get both of the spurs to bite into the wood oftentimes in the direction of the grain, though I don't think it matters. But it penetrates into the wood more easily if I'm pushing it in between the fibers instead of trying to cut across the fibers. If I put a huge wheel on this and continued to crank, yes, I absolutely could. But I'm not going to push it that hard. So now, it's reasonably well balanced. It's just a chunk of wood on here. I will move the tool rest back, rotate the wood, and get it as close as possible without touching. Well, we're touching one small place, so I'll adjust it back a little bit, and away we go. I very much like using a curved tool rest for the outside, but this one's too tall to fit in the banjo here because this banjo was designed with this post right over the cam mechanism instead of to the side where you could use any length tool post. So I rotate the piece of wood and notice that I'm pushing the top of this piece of wood away, whereas when I turn the machine on, the machine brings the top of the wood towards me. Why do you suppose that is? It's to prevent fingers getting pinched. Fingers, if I pull the piece and my fingers happen to stay on the surface and get sucked right into that little gap, they get kind of pinched up. Also, the very palm of your hand can get pinched into an area like that. I've been to a couple summer picnics with wood turners where you see somebody running around with a little baggie of ice on their hand because they didn't do that. So your number one good technique, the first technique that you should learn as a good habit, is to rotate the wood away from you, and you will not pinch your fingers or palm for the rest of your wood turning career. And it's also a very good idea to have your face protected. This shield looks peculiar, and it doesn't offer quite as much protection as the really heavy-duty ones. And tonight it wouldn't be necessary, but when I'm without a microphone, this allows people to hear me as I'm speaking with the shield down. We're ready to go. Turn the machine on. Increase the speed. I'll feel the vibration because I know that this piece of wood is reasonably balanced but not perfectly balanced. And how fast can we go? Each piece will be a little bit different. And we have the luxury of a speed control here. So we're about 1,000 RPM, and that's all great. Pardon me? And that will go down as we cut. So I will start with the roughly 30-degree tool. Place it on the tool rest, tilt the handle down so that the tip of the tool is pointing up at a 45-degree angle. Is that the way that the typical way that you're using bowl gouges? So if the flute is pointing straight up, we risk aligning it with the grain and splitting a piece out like firewood. If the flute is all the way over on its side, the wood flowing down can't get into the flute. There are two motions that are happening here. Wood is flowing down into the flute, and the tool is going to be sliding left or right. And so wood is flowing into the tool in two directions, straight down and left or right. If I put the tool at 45, with the tip of the tool at 45 degrees, both directions of wood flow into the flute equally well. I anchor the tool against the tool rest. I bring the tool up close until it just starts cutting the wood, and I slide along. And the purpose here is to remove the out of round wood and give us a cylinder. How's that floor vibration going, Bruce? 'Tis indeed. All right, we're gonna go. So it came back because I increased the speed. I'm on the lowest transmission setting, but this, let's tighten the belt just a pinch and try it again. So it's working, it's cutting relatively smoothly, but it was fighting just a little bit. And right here we have an interrupted cut. What you see is that we're cutting wood here and skipping wood there, cutting again. And the job is to hold the tool at the same spot so that it touches. And if we push in, the wood comes down here, whacks the tool, knocks it out of the way. So the interrupted cut requires a little bit of control. We push down with the thumb, add a little friction onto the tool rest, and push the tool in a straight path, not pushing the bevel firmly against the wood just yet, because we can rely on pushing the bevel against the wood here. But once we get here where it's interrupted and we're not cutting, if I push in, the wood comes back down, whacks the tool out of my hand, and it gets really lumpy and makes a big mess and a lot of noise. That's 30 degrees. We can go to 35-degree tool. Pick up where I left off. It's a mite smoother, largely because it's much more round. We're at, well, that was 35-40. Now we're at 52 degrees. And it's cutting very nicely. And it's cutting very nicely in the interrupted area. There was a little bit more shaking going on there because now there's a much larger gap between the wood and the tool rest than there was when I started. So I'm going to bring the tool rest in a little bit closer and raise it just a little bit. Again, I'll explain when we have a cylinder and can show a little bit better the bevel guided cut. Boom. Oh, I wasn't supposed to do that. All right, now it's done. It doesn't matter. Oh, there's going to be more. All right, so now 58 degrees. Tool number 4. Yep. So the previous tool and this one fall within the Ellsworth profile. There are in fact 2 of these tools. And the difference between these tools is that we have an elliptical flute here and a U-shaped flute there. Is it showing well from the top? Okay, great. And the 2 cut very, very similarly. In a little bit later, I'll show you one of the V flutes that is even smaller than this elliptical flute. Sometimes the smaller flute can get a little bit jammed. I typically don't find a huge amount of difference between all of these tools, or the different flutes. But there are a couple places where there is a preference. Now we're up to number 5, which is the 65-degree tool. And notice that my arm position is different. But I'm cutting well with control. I'm leaving a quite acceptable surface along the face grain. There's always a little bit of tear out. This piece of wood is punky. It was too crummy to actually make a bowl, so it's really good for this demonstration. Now, on to 72 degrees. Thank you. And you're probably wondering about the wing of that spur drive. We're plenty clear of it, so that was no big deal. A little bit more. Now, 72 degrees. So we'll finish up here. And this tool has the V-shaped flute. See how much narrower it is at the tip? And you just saw that the chips got clogged up. And that's the major disadvantage to the small flute. Many people would say that the 72-degree tool can't possibly work worth a darn. And now we're going up to, oh, nope, that was the 80-degree tool. That's about as far as I push it. And the surface of this wood is really pretty good. The punky part we'll ignore. That's pretty good, solid, stout wood. And it works just fine. So, oh, yes. So let's put this, let's throw this away and get another one. And Greg, you forgot to remind me. Did I ask you to remind me? I might not have. I will tell you why the tool rest is lower, and will also address Phil's comment about the tool handle angle was different. And that's because the angle at the end of the tool was different. So the handle has to be placed where it needs to be so that the tool can cut, in this case, a straight line to the left. If you look, analyze the tool, put a bevel against the back of, put a pencil against the back of the bevel, and this shows you the direction in which the tool will make its cut. You can't have the pencil there while you're making the cut. The piece of substrate that you're cutting will be there. But this lets you really understand what that angle is. And this angle can be as low as 30 degrees and as high as 80 degrees. So we think of where we place this angle. We tilt the flute to open it to 45 degrees. Look at only the very tip of that tool, guide it with this bevel, and then the handle has to be wherever the handle is based on the angle of the tool. So those tools are both pointing, oh, wrong one. Those two tools are pointing to the left, and we see a difference of 80 minus 30 or 50 degrees of tool handle angle. So I use this entire range of tools to make cuts to the left. Which one is better? Well, they all work, right? So this may sort of debunk a little bit. My tool's better than your tool. You should switch to my tool, because the 7 tools just did the same thing on the outside of a bowl. Now, we can look at it a little bit more carefully and find that there are in fact places where the extreme angle tools will work better in certain situations, and the two extremes absolutely cannot be interchanged because they are extremes. And the one in the middle probably will do almost everything on the outside, pretty much almost everything. It's not that it's bad, it's totally different. It doesn't fit in this description. I could, but I can make a smoother surface with any one of these tools than you can make with the best carbide tool with a brand new insert. AJ. The carbide tools are scrapers. Correct. And there are some carbide tools that have cups. So again, Brad? Why would you rough out with a carbide tool first? I can beat you there too. Ooh. I think I think I think that we may have to buy a pizza and just do this. And since there's a pizza, we'll both be winners, and that's all that matters. No, no. No, no, no. We just split the price of a pizza. It's no big deal. Okay, so yes. So what we're doing is cutting. That's slicing the fiber, and the bevel is sliding on the surface that you cut in the previous rotation. And if you hold the bevel against that surface, you can slide it in a very smooth motion. And you can get a very smooth surface that's cut, and its knife cutting is better than any scraping cut because it tears fibers the least. Also, if you're not guiding the tool with the bevel, then the radius of your cut, the distance from the center axis, is determined by how much, as you're holding the tool, how much the tool drifts in and out. And you get little ridges with a carbide tool, and if you want to minimize those ridges, you have to hold the tool very closely, very carefully, watch it, squeeze, and the last cut with a scraper of that type is always going to give you a little bit of roughness, and you're going to fight and do a whole heck of a lot more work to get that surface smooth. Did I cut anyone off on that topic, the scraper topic of this conversation? So we're moving on. We have another piece of wood. I'll make a cylinder. I'm sorry. We need a cylinder again, so we need to make a new one. And now let's just see how everything's going here. Slow the speed down because we have this unknown wobble factor. Let's feel that floor shake a little bit, and we'll get ready to turn. And now We want to remove a lot of wood with a scraper, right? That not enough? All right, we're going on to make a nice cylinder. And now, here's the other thing you can't do with a scraper is get lots of souvenirs to take home. The bevel is so powerful at guiding this tool along that I don't have to be controlling the radius of this piece by holding the tool, holding the distance from the axis. I'm merely aiming the tool to the left, pushing it against the bevel, and pushing the tool to the left. The rotation of the lathe is bringing the wood and feeding it down into the tool. It's going into the tool much faster than it's going to the left, so the amount that I push is minimal compared to the force that the lathe is providing. And Bruce, smooth enough? There's a couple little ridges in there. If I was watching, if I was holding, if I was pushing the tool down on the tool rest, I would minimize a little bit of that vibration and that would be gone. Okay, so this was roughly the 50 or 60 degree tool, the Ellsworth type of a grind. Who is using the 40-40 grind? I see a bunch of hands. Were you using the 40-40 grind before Stuart Batty seminars? So prior to hearing Stuart Batty, I was using a 45-45 grind, which I can do on the very grind jig. I have to do it with two different settings to get this edge just right. But let's take a look at my 45-45 degree tool. And the Stuart Batty 40-40, and guess what? I need the tool rest a little closer because I'm running out of room. Whoops. So the 40-40 that I made was made with the V flute because I had one that wasn't in use and I clogged it. Stuart does make his out of the elliptical flute. It won't clog anywhere near as much, and my 45-45 was made out of elliptical flute tools. So this is a record power tool. This tool is probably 30 years old. And when I was beginning wood turning, I bought, I think, 2 of these when a shop was going out of business. And I got them really cheap. And now I kind of know why, because I end up clogging them all the time. They are absolutely fantastic for finish work. The tip is very narrow. It will go into tiny places. So the tool that will work very well as a finishing tool in a tiny place is probably not the same tool that's going to be working well for hogging out lots of wood and making a really rough cut. So once again, there are more there are places where the nuances of the tools will really help you out. But I think you've seen that just about any tool that you're using is going to work pretty darn well for you. So I now have a bowl shape that I have a shape that has been cut not into a cylinder but cut into some rather random stair steps. In fact, one of the approaches that I like very much is to use the stair stepping approach to make a very pixelated bowl shape. And the reason being that the motion that I'm making is extremely ergonomic. It's very easy to do. I can remove a lot of wood rather quickly. And I do it all with the tool close to my body and shifting essentially straight to the left. I will use this approach many, many times just because it's comfortable. It doesn't involve a lot of reaching, a lot of swinging, moving of the body and such, but it doesn't make a curve. But I just removed a huge amount of wood this way. Now I will make a curve from the base up to the rim of the bowl. Punky piece of wood. This is just junk. And there are two ways that, I promised I would show you the tool rest thing, and I'll get to it. So if I fail you again on that, raise your hand and make me stick to it. So what you saw a moment ago is a nice cut. You see that I'm quite comfortable. I'm looking down, I can see what's going on. My tool rest seems to be annoying Greg that it's way too low. Why in the world would I do that? Well, let's make it even lower. It's as low as it will go on this machine. Now it looks freaky low, right? Seems to be working pretty well to me. So what's going on here? One more extreme. The angle of the tool touching the wood doesn't change. But the angle of the tool to my body changes enormously. So there's a nice little chip. And if I drop the tool rest, you can see that I can be cutting this chip right there. Oh, it's going to fall off. Oh well. There's the chip, and if I raise the tool handle, I'm keeping the perspective of the tool to the wood, to the chip exactly the same, and I can do that and use the tool rest at any of those heights. This is not particularly comfortable to me. And the tool rest way down here is very comfortable. Why? Because this lathe is higher than ordinary. I think your lathe is lower than this one, and therefore you would raise the tool rest. So the appropriate tool rest for you and the situation really is when your elbow and shoulder are comfortable, when you can see what's going on, because the equipment doesn't care where the tool is. It's going to make the same cut. So at the end of the night, go home a little bit more comfortable. Nothing like making a cup of tea at the end of the evening and going, what's going on here? And you just beat up on your shoulder by having the tool rest at the wrong position. Inside a bowl, all bets are off, because sometimes you have to put that tool tip right where it needs to go. So the tools are doing a great job along here. So I've made this sort of pixelated view, and if you don't know what that means, think of like the first computer that you used back in the late 70s or the 80s, whether it was like a Commodore 64 or a IBM PC or something like that, and you had some graphics, and you take a piece of a graphic file and you expand it, and all of a sudden it looks very ugly. It has the square corners because it's made up of these little squares, and you make each square bigger. And so now if essentially you connect the dots of these corners, you have a curve. So let's do that. Grain running across like this is like the end grain of a plank. If we want to cut with the grain, we're going to cut along the face and turn and come around the corner. So that means face is here. We will cut around this corner. Not on this side, but you can see my hand better. Well, we could. I've done it. I've been on the other side of my lathe many times. So that means cutting from this base out and around. This will be the spigot that I will grab in the chuck when we do the inside. So I want to connect only these curves. And I can start in here. Well, let's see. Here's where the angle really comes into play. If I want to cut right along the bottom of this, I need to put the tool handle over here. And that's going to be very inconvenient when I'm cutting between centers. You can solve that by putting this piece of wood on a faceplate, removing the tailstock. You can put the tool over here. You can reach way over your lathe and begin the cut and enjoy this wonderful swing of the tool handle and make a nice surface. Or, there's always an or. You get into the Ellsworth range and you can start roughly right about here. Pardon? 50, 60 degrees. It all depends on the variables, how you sharpen it. I can't get in there quite tight enough, but I can start connecting those dots. And if I miss one, I'm just cutting the mountains off and bringing them down to the valleys. And so I missed one right there. I'll have to cut again. If I go to the 40-40 grind, oh, I can't start this far back. I can only begin roughly here. And now I can shape the outside just beautifully. Little rugged on the end there. And now, if I go to the 80-degree tool, oh, look at this. I can cut in, swing around, and I can't be greedy with this tool. But I can put the tool right into that crook right here and cut the outside shape of the bowl. And if I want to be crazy enough, I can continue using this tool all the way around the outside face. But now I'm cutting dead across end grain with the highest tool angle that I have in the kit. And it's very hard to push. I'm using a bevel guided cut. And from what I understand, I'm using a bevel guided cut and I'm pulling the tool towards me. When I stand on the other side, I'm doing the same bevel guided cut and I'm pushing the tool away from me, except that I'm in a too tight a spot. So every cut that I've been showing you relies on guiding the bevel on the very center of the tool and cutting with the leading edge. And in all the cuts that we've made, the leading edge is left and we're cutting to the left. If the bowl was over here and it was reversed, everything that I said that was left becomes right. Now, when the force is being pushed down right here and the bevel is being pushed against the wood, it seems to me to be a whole lot easier to control. If I'm pushing down on this side, the tool can spin out of control much more easily. So I rarely do that. Sometimes on the inside of a bowl with a steep angle tool, I will do that. I haven't done it in so long. We'll try it. So when I tilt the tool across like that, I leave a nice square corner because the tip of this tool is, or let's start all over again. If I hold the bevel absolutely horizontal and then I drop a perpendicular right here, the only part of the tool that touches the perpendicular is the tip, and that means that the tip rolled over onto its side fits into a square corner. Anytime the tool edge bulges over, you leave a rounded corner there. When the tool is all the way over on its side, it's in its least efficient form, but we're only taking off a little tiny bit of wood. So that's how I left that nice square corner there. Now we're going to go to Ralph's. I believe is this what it looks like, Ralph? So while the bevel is guided, it's very easy to take, see the thick and thin chips? By the amount that I push, I can very easily change the thickness of the chip. And I get a little bit of a wavy surface. If instead I push the center of the bevel against the wood, I will now take a very uniform thickness chip, and this will be done with essentially no waviness. So I think that this pulling cut is going to be something that's very useful when you have a rough bowl and you're removing vast quantities of wood rather rapidly, and that the center bevel guided cut is going to be something that's going to be helpful for your finished cuts. Does that make sense? Okay, great. So now, okay, we talked about the different angles, and when we go to the 80-degree tool, I can cut all the way from this base out to all the way to the rim. But what I usually do is cut only until I can pick it up with about a 40 or 50 degree tool and then finish coming along here. Because right here on the end grain, this cut will be so much better with a low angle tool like 40 degrees. But it can't work down in here. So 80 degrees works down there very well, 40 degrees works here very well. The 50 or 60 degree does almost everything, and so the choice becomes yours. Do you want all these tools and switch here and there, That gets to be a little bit crazy. But when you get into a situation where you have a really tough job making a really good surface, you can switch to one of the specialty tools and fix that sort of thing right there. Now, if I'm using a 50 or a 60 degree tool and I want to get the tool way back into here, and you see that I cannot, I can cut against the grain. If the tool is well sharpened, anchor, bevel, begin the cut, take a small shaving, advance the tool slowly, and I can make a very nice job making a nice smooth curve over there. But when you compare the surface of the against the grain cut with the grain cut, you will find that in the torn section, and this is the section where the knife edge is, we got a little loose, where the knife is approaching the face grain, going from end grain, making a small venture through an against the grain cut before it comes up to along the face grain. And there'll be a spot here and a spot there, and you can see that the tear out going against the grain is much, much worse when I'm cutting the knife absolutely against the grain rather than when I'm going with the grain. So while especially in making a twice turn bowl where the first one first cutting action leaves a rough surface, it's going to be cut again. This doesn't matter, and I will very often cut against the grain down here, leave a bit of fuzz there. When I'm finishing the bowl, I'll go to the 80-degree tool and I'll finish this area with that. And it makes a really big difference. So now we'll put this tenon, or this spigot tenon. I dislike calling this a tenon because the grain is running across here and that breaks right off, and I think of a tenon as being a structural joint. This is not. Okay, so we'll do just a little bit on the inside. So we're just going to go into the lightning round. Right now I'm just making that spigot small enough that it will fit into the chuck jaws. If I have a lump of wood at the end, I make this sort of shape when I'm doing twice turn bowl, because I do not have a once I snap this off, I will not have a center mark. So, come over here. So, after I remove a bunch of wood from the inside of this, allow this to dry, later I'm going to want to remount it on the lathe. I want to remount it as close to the same spot as it's mounted tonight. And you can see the center mark right here, but now it's gone. So, what did I do with it? Thank you, Mike. That never happens at home. When it's missed, oh, well, thank you for rescuing it. So, when it's missing in my shop, I know who's to blame. So, you see the cup? And this little protrusion? It fits into the cup. So there's my center for the next turning part. All right, I'll keep it there where it will behave. Yes, there are a lot of round items in wood turning, and things can roll away from you. Well, let's hope it fits. Oh, it's right on the edge. That's what you get for doing things with just visual clues. Alright, so now I need to set the tool rest at an elevation where I can cut straight across here and hit the very center, because if I'm not cutting at the center, I'll never remove that little pip in the middle. And so now, regardless of whether the lathe is too high or too low for me, I have to work with that constraint. Squeech. Hope it holds enough so that we can demonstrate what's going on here. I'll cut straight across the front so that we get rid of all that ragged edge, and I will do it gently because we have only a tenuous hold. And so here I'm cutting end grain and face grain, end grain and face grain. So what's the right angle? Well, one in the middle, not one of the extremes, because we're cutting both end grain and face grain. So we're pretty close to done there. Oh. I'll get to it in a minute. So there are all sorts of ways to remove wood from the bowl, and one of the approaches is to make a little tiny bowl, make a little egg cup, make that bowl bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and that is a whole lot of handle swinging. So I don't do that. I use a shallow angle, 30-35 degrees, and I'll cut in and I'll make a little bowl, make a little egg cup, and then the heck with all of this stuff. I am largely cutting across end grain. And I'll just continue to cut like this because it's so much easier. Okay, so that's 30 degrees. Let's go to the 40-40. Also a really good weapon for this job. And I come around the corner. You notice that I'm leaving a volcano in the middle. And I'll show you the 45-degree tool, which is also really good because we're cutting across end grain. As we come around the corner, boom, I'm bumping into that volcano. So I switch the tool around and I cut. Whoops, got a little bit too loose. Got loose. We'll try one more time and then we'll get ready to go home. So I think you can see that the theme of this is very much like doing the steps on the outside to make the pixelated shape, because I don't have to reach very much. I don't reach much when I cut in on the outside curve. I don't reach much when I'm removing the volcano. Now, because I set the tool rest so that the tip of the tool cuts the middle of the bowl with the handle at a comfortable position to begin with, but once I get inside the bowl, if I push the tool farther in, you see it goes way too high, so I have to raise my arm and I get into a slightly uncomfortable position right here. I could stop and lower the tool rest. I usually just don't unless it's a big piece, but if it's really big, I'm probably coring it anyway. So now if I go to the inside and try to finish with the 40-40 tool, okay, this is the 45, and I know it's loose, but we're just going to live with it. I get into the position where the tool starts to bump the rim of the bowl because it just won't make it around that corner. So I can go to like the 65 or 68 degree tool. And you can see that I can go around the corner all the way to the center. And at this point where we're really close to the end, I like to use a tool rest like this that goes into the bowl nicely with a curved edge on it. We'll work with what we have right now, which is lowering this tool rest a bit, bringing it inside the bowl, setting it so the handle can be much lower and I can still hit the bottom. And it's worth it to change the tool rest when you're getting towards the end of the bowl so that you can make your last few cuts with good control. And this is in fact even a little bit too low, so I go 10 degrees more shallow, and instead of the almost 70 degrees, the 60-degree tool is doing better. I'm running into the tool rest here, so we go back to the 50-degree tool, and you can see that you certainly don't need them all, but they help you define where it is that you're cutting. Instead of trying to use 7 tools or 10 or whatever's in there, you will just adjust your tool rest a little bit, or in the case of this lathe with the movable headstock, slide it over here, take the tailstock out of the way, the ways of the lathe disappear, and you can make the inside cuts in here very nicely. I know we're running out of time, so are there any last questions? Oh, so what I So Peter asked the tool, wait a minute, profiles or the flute profile? Flute profile, that's V or elliptical or U. So the U shape clears very easily. The V sometimes gets a little bit crunched up. The tip of this V tool gets into tiny spots when I'm cutting in very small things. The V is the cat's meow. This is the same tool that I was using before, a V versus the elliptical. Now, way out on this edge, this might be a little bit risky. I'm cutting with the 30-degree tool. This one is the U, the most open of the tools. And this is where I will sometimes do Ralph's push cut. I'm actually not bevel guiding on the tip and using the leading edge. I'm using the trailing edge. And the reason that this works so nicely is because this chunk of cutting edge is very thin, and it's not, if I tried to do this with a V gouge, I wouldn't have the control. And this will, well, that's kind of in the way, but that's beside the point. We have to watch where we're going. Start very easily, gently. I am now doing a trailing edge cut, and I'm running into that really rough cut because this is off center. Anything else? Good night.